The world is a cacophony of waste. That is the first thing you learn when you spend 40 years listening to the dying breaths of machinery and men. People believe that silence is the natural state of the universe, interrupted only by events. But they are wrong. The universe is a constant grinding scream of data. There is the 60-cycle hum of the electrical grid vibrating in the walls. There is the thermal expansion of the wooden beams in the ceiling. There is the low-frequency rumble of tires on asphalt 3 streets away, transmitting through the earth like a tremor. Most people filter this out. They have biological noise gates in their brains that allow them to function without going insane. I do not have that luxury. I hear everything. I hear the bearing failing in the refrigerator compressor in the kitchen. I hear the slight arrhythmia in my son-in-law's heartbeat from across the table. I hear the lie forming in his throat before it even reaches his tongue. I sat at the mahogany dining table, staring at a plate of cold roast beef. I wore my headphones, large over-ear noise-cancelling units that my daughter, Sarah, had bought me for Christmas 3 years ago. She thought they were for comfort. She thought I was listening to classical music, or perhaps white noise to soothe the shell shock she imagined I carried from some vague, undefined service to the country. She didn't know that the batteries were dead. She didn't know the cable wasn't plugged into anything. I wore them because they acted as a low-pass filter. They muffled the sharp, jagged treble of their voices, the frequencies of panic and deception, and allowed me to focus on the bass. The truth always lives in the bass. It's a catastrophe, Sarah. A total, unmitigated disaster. Mark was pacing the length of the dining room. His Italian leather loafers clicked against the hardwood floor with a sharp, aggressive staccato. Click, clack, click, clack. The tempo was 120 beats per minute. The rhythm of a man whose adrenaline is spiking his cortisol levels into the danger zone. Mark was 40 years old, the director of public relations for Vanguard Aviation. He wore suits that were cut too slim, and cologne that smelled of desperation and musk. Tonight, his tie was loosened, hanging like a noose around his neck, and his face was flushed a deep, vascular red. "The stock is down 12% in after-hours trading," Mark shouted into his Bluetooth earpiece, ignoring his wife and me completely. "Do you hear me? 12%. That's $400 million of market cap vaporized in 3 hours because some joystick jockey in Nevada forgot how to fly." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. I could hear the tinny, distorted leakage from his earpiece. It was the CEO. His voice was a flat line of cold fury. "No, sir," Mark stammered, pivoting on his heel. "We are controlling the narrative. We are pivoting to pilot error. Yes, human factors. Fatigue, disorientation. We paint the pilot as incompetent, and the machine remains pristine. The XM-9 drone is flawless. That is the line. That is the truth we are selling." I picked up my fork. The metal scraped against the porcelain plate. Scree. It was a quiet sound to anyone else. To me, it was a tactile vibration that travelled up my arm. Mark stopped pacing. He pulled the earpiece away from his ear and glared at me. His eyes were wide, manic. "Sarah," he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "Can you please tell your father to stop making that noise? He's scraping the plate like he's trying to dig a tunnel. God, it's like living with a metronome." Sarah looked at me. She was a good woman, tired, caught between a husband who was drowning in corporate avarice and a father she believed was sliding into senility. She touched my arm gently. "Dad," she said, exaggerating her lip movements as if I were deaf. "The plate. Quietly, please." I looked at her. I didn't blink. I didn't speak. I hadn't spoken a full sentence to Mark in 5 years. Words are just more noise. If you don't have a signal to transmit, you should keep the channel clear. I nodded slowly and put the fork down. "He's deaf as a post," Mark muttered, putting the earpiece back in. "And he's staring again. It's creepy." "He's not creepy, Mark. He's traumatized," Sarah defended me, though her heart wasn't in it. She was exhausted. "Just finish your call." Mark turned his back on us. "Listen to me," he said into the phone. "The crash in the suburbs. I know it looks bad. A 2-ton autonomous cargo drone turning a family's garage into a smoking crater is difficult optics. But we have the telemetry. Or we will. The NTSB is sending a Go team, but we have the raw data dump from the cloud. I'm going to review it tonight. If I find 1 second of hesitation from the remote operator, we crucify him. We save the contract with Amazon. We save the company." He hung up the phone and slammed it onto the table. The vibrations rattled the water glasses. "I need a drink," Mark announced. He walked to the sidebar and poured 3 fingers of scotch. His hands were shaking. I could hear the ice cubes clinking against the glass. A chaotic, irregular rattle. Clink, clink, clack. He walked back to the table and opened his laptop. He didn't sit down. He stood there, hovering over the screen like a vulture. "You want to know the truth?" Mark said, looking at Sarah but pointing a finger at the screen. "This pilot, Evans, he's a washout. Failed his commercial check ride twice. We hired him because he was cheap and he had security clearance. And now he's cost us everything." "Is he okay?" Sarah asked softly. "The pilot? I heard he had a seizure in the control trailer." "He's in a coma," Mark said, dismissing the human cost with a wave of his hand. "Stroke, seizure, panic attack. Who cares? It proves he was unfit. It proves the hardware didn't fail." He typed a password. The laptop chimed. "I have the audio," Mark said. "The CVDR cockpit voice and data recorder. It uploaded to the cloud right before impact. I haven't listened to it yet, but I know what I'm going to hear. I'm going to hear him screaming." I shifted in my chair. The CVDR. The black box. Although they are never black, they are international orange, painted to be seen in the wreckage of a jungle or the silt of the ocean floor. It is the only honest thing in the aviation industry. Pilots lie. Maintenance logs are forged. Radar data is interpolated. But the box remembers. The box captures the vibration of the truth. "Mark, maybe you shouldn't listen to that here," Sarah said, looking at me. "Dad is sensitive to loud noises." "Dad is in another dimension," Mark scoffed. "Besides, I need a witness. I need you to hear how incompetent this guy was." He hit the space bar. The sound erupted from the tiny, tinny speakers of the MacBook Pro. It was a jagged, distorted assault on the senses. Laptop speakers are incapable of reproducing accurate audio. They clip the highs and muddy the lows. But the violence of the recording was unmistakable. Screesh. That was the wind. The sound of aerodynamic shear as the airframe exceeded its velocity, never exceed limit, VNE. The drone was diving. Then the alarms. Pull up, terrain, terrain. The synthetic voice of the ground proximity warning system, GPWS. Cold, masculine, monotone. It was a digital ghost announcing the end of the world. And then the pilot, or rather the remote operator sitting in a trailer 3,000 miles away, connected by satellite link. She's nosing over. I can't stop it. Disengaging auto. Manual. Manual. Why isn't she responding? Oh God, the stick is dead. She's dead. The voice was pitched high, cracking with terror. It was the sound of a man realizing his mortality. Then a loud metallic bang. Then static. Mark slammed the laptop shut. See? Mark shouted, his face triumphant. He panicked. Why isn't she responding? That means he lost situational awareness. He probably stalled it and locked the control surfaces. It's pilot error. We have him. Sarah looked pale. She put a hand to her mouth. That was horrible. It was the sound of our stock price recovering, Mark said, taking a massive gulp of scotch. I'll write the press release tonight. Tragic human error. Vanguard Aviation mourns the loss caused by operator disorientation. It's perfect. I sat perfectly still. I hadn't moved a muscle. Inside my noise-cancelling headphones, the sound was muffled, but I had heard it. I didn't hear what Mark heard. I didn't hear the panic. I didn't hear the narrative. I heard the hum. It was buried deep in the mix. Maybe minus 40 decibels relative to the noise floor. A low frequency vibration that the laptop speakers struggled to reproduce, but my ears, trained by 4 decades of deciphering crushed magnetic tape, locked onto instantly. It was a rhythmic oscillation. Pitch, approximately 400 Hz. Waveform, sawtooth, with irregular harmonics. 400 Hz is the standard frequency for aircraft AC power systems. It is the heartbeat of aviation. But a clean AC system hums. This didn't hum. It growled. It had texture. It had teeth. I closed my eyes. I visualized the waveform. It wasn't smooth. It was jagged. There was a secondary frequency riding underneath it. A sub-harmonic. Clack, clack, clack. I counted the beats in my head, syncing them to the screams of the pilot. 1 beat every 0.5 seconds, increasing in tempo. It was a sound I hadn't heard in 20 years. Not since 1998. Not since the Pacific Ocean swallowed a McDonnell Douglas MD-80. It was the sound of mechanical agony. Bill? Mark's voice cut through my analysis. He was snapping his fingers in front of my face. Hello. Earth to the vegetable garden. Mark sneered. I opened my eyes. Mark was grinning, fueled by alcohol and the false relief of finding a scapegoat. You didn't hear a word of that, did you? Mark laughed. Just sitting there in your bubble. Must be nice to be so oblivious. He grabbed the laptop. He pulled the USB drive, a silver ruggedized stick, out of the port and tossed it onto the table while he finished his drink. I'm going to write the statement, Mark announced. Sarah, bring me coffee in an hour. And put him to bed. He's vibrating. Mark walked out of the room, heading toward his home office. He left the USB drive on the table next to the centerpiece. A careless mistake. A mistake born of arrogance. He thought he had the file on the laptop, so the drive was redundant. He thought he was the only one in the house who knew what it was. I looked at the silver stick. Dad, Sarah whispered. Are you okay? You're sweating. I looked at my daughter. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to say, your husband is about to frame an innocent man for a mechanical failure that will kill again if it isn't stopped. But I couldn't. Not yet. I needed the receipts. The truth has a frequency, and I needed to isolate it. Tired, I rasped. It was the first word I'd spoken in 3 days. My voice was like gravel in a mixer. Okay, Sarah sighed. Let's get you downstairs. I stood up. I shuffled. I played the part. The shuffling old man. The relic. I waited. The house settles at 2 a.m. That is when the thermal contraction of the joists stops and the ambient noise floor drops to its minimum. I lay in my bed in the guest room on the ground floor. I listened to the house breathe. I heard Mark upstairs in the master bedroom. He was snoring. It was a jagged, unhealthy snore. Sleep apnea. His airway was obstructing. He was choking on his own ego even in his sleep. I heard Sarah in the guest room down the hall. Her breathing was rhythmic, soft. I sat up. I didn't move like an old man now. I swung my legs over the side of the bed with the precision of a cat. I stood up. My knees didn't pop. I knew how to stand to minimize the joint friction. I opened the door. I knew the hinge squeaked at the halfway point, so I opened it fast to minimize the duration of the sound. Squeak. Short. Indistinguishable from a settling beam. I walked into the dining room. The moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the table. The USB drive was still there, sitting next to the crystal vase. Mark, in his drunken victory lap, had forgotten to retrieve it. I picked it up. It was cold metal. It felt heavy, though it weighed only a few grams. It contained the death of a machine and the potential death of a man's reputation. I slipped it into the pocket of my pajama pants. I walked to the door that led to the basement. This was the boundary. Upstairs was their world, the world of noise, PR spin, and lies. Downstairs was my world. I opened the door. The smell hit me instantly. Ozone, dust, static electricity, the smell of magnetic tape and heated vacuum tubes. It was the smell of truth. I descended the wooden stairs. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I didn't need it. I knew every inch of this space. I reached the bottom and walked to the heavy, soundproof door I had installed 10 years ago. Solid core oak, sealed with neoprene gaskets. I opened it and stepped inside. My sanctuary. The room was lined with acoustic wedge foam, grey and charcoal, absorbing every stray reflection. In the centre of the room sat my rack. It was an altar to analogue fidelity in a digital age. A Studer A807 reel-to-reel tape machine. A vintage Tektronix oscilloscope with a round glowing green CRT screen. A bank of outboard equalizers, Manley, Neve, API. And my speakers. Genelec 1031A monitors. The most honest speakers ever built. They didn't make things sound good. They made things sound real. I sat in my Aeron chair. The mesh groaned softly. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket. I plugged it into my interface, a high-end digital to analog converter. I didn't use a computer screen for analysis. I used my ears and the oscilloscope. Eyes can be fooled. Ears cannot. I reached for my real headphones, not the Bose toys. These were Sony MDR7506S, the industry standard. I had worn a pair of these while listening to the screams of 300 people on a jumbo jet in 1985. I had worn them while decoding the explosion of the Challenger. They were an extension of my skull. I put them on. The seal was perfect. I reached out and flipped the master power switch on the rack. Thrum. The equipment woke up. The VU meters glowed a warm yellow. The oscilloscope warmed up, the green dots appearing in the center of the grid. Let's listen, I whispered. I initiated the file transfer. I routed the digital signal through the Neve preamp to give it warmth, then into the equalizer, then into the oscilloscope. I pressed play. The sound flooded my head. Screech. It was painful. The digital compression from the cloud upload was harsh. It sounded like broken glass. My hand flew to the equalizer. Filter, I muttered. High pass at 200 Hz. I turned the knob. The low-end rumble of the wind buffeting disappeared. The screech became thinner, more focused. Low pass at 5 kHz. I cut the high-end hiss. Now I had the mid-range, the vocal range. Pull up, pull up. Quiet you, I said to the machine voice. I engaged a parametric notch filter. I swept the frequency knob until I found the exact pitch of the alarm, 1.2 kHz. I dialed it out, cutting it by 15 decibels. The alarm faded into the background. Now I had the pilot. She's nosing over, disengaging auto. I listened to his voice. I heard the tremors in his vocal cords. He was terrified, yes, but he wasn't confused. He was reacting. He was fighting a physical force. Why isn't she responding? I reached for the gain knob. I boosted the ambient noise floor, the silence behind the voice. There it was, the hum. I routed the signal to the oscilloscope. The green line danced on the screen. It wasn't a clean sine wave. It was a jagged, tortured mess. I zoomed in on the frequency. 400 Hz. Confirmed. The AC motor. But look at the harmonics. I stared at the glowing green line. It was spiking. There was a rhythmic transient riding on top of the hum. Clack, clack, clack. I closed my eyes, visualizing the anatomy of the XM9 drone. I knew the schematics. I read Aviation Week like other men read the Bible. The XM9 uses a trimmable horizontal stabilizer. The entire tail moves up and down to control the pitch. It is moved by a jack screw, a massive threaded rod driven by an electric motor. The motor spins the nut moves the rod moves the tail. If the motor is spinning, the 400 Hz hum. But the tail isn't moving. The pilot shouting, "Why isn't she responding?" Then the connection is broken. But it wasn't just broken. It was slipping. Clack, clack, clack. That was the sound of the threads jumping. The nut was stripping off the bolt. The metal was exhausted. It was grinding itself into dust. I reached for the compressor. I smashed the dynamic range to bring the quietest sounds to the front. Go! Snap. I froze. Right there. 2 seconds before the pilot screamed, "Oh God." A sound like a gunshot. A sharp, violent transient that peaked the meters. Snap. And then, wah! The hum changed pitch. It went up. The motor sped up. Why would the motor speed up? Because the load was gone. The bolt had sheared. The stabilizer had disconnected completely. The tail was flapping in the wind like a broken shutter. The drone pitched over because it physically lost its tail, not because the pilot stalled it. It wasn't pilot error. It was mechanical negligence. Someone hadn't greased the jack screw. Someone had skipped the torque check. "The Death Rattle," I whispered. "I hear you." I sat back in my chair. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drum in my chest. This wasn't just a crash. This was a crime scene. And Mark was about to bury the evidence. The door to the basement slammed open. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Light flooded the stairwell. Mark stood at the top of the stairs. He was wearing silk pajamas. His hair was messy, his eyes wild. He held a flashlight in his hand like a weapon. He stomped down the stairs. "You stole it!" Mark screamed. "I woke up and the drive was gone. You senile old thief. That is classified company property. That is federal evidence." He rushed into the room. He saw the equipment, the glowing tubes, the green line on the scope, the reels spinning slowly. He stopped, confused. He'd never been down here. He thought I just had a TV and a recliner. "What is this junk?" Mark spat. He reached for the USB drive sitting in the interface. "Give it to me. I'm calling the police. I'm having you committed, Bill. This is the last straw. You're going to a home." I didn't flinch. I didn't hand him the drive. I swiveled my Aeron chair slowly to face him. I took off the headphones. I placed them gently on the desk. I looked Mark in the eye. "Sit down, Mark," I said. My voice wasn't the gravelly mumble he was used to. It was deep, resonant, controlled. It was the voice that had commanded silence in NTSB hearing rooms for 30 years. Mark froze. He blinked. He looked at me as if a stranger had just inhabited my body. "What?" Mark stammered. I said, "Sit down." I pointed to a folding metal chair in the corner. Mark didn't sit. He trembled with rage. "You have no idea what you're messing with. That audio proves the pilot panicked. I have to release the statement. The market's open in 4 hours." "It proves nothing of the sort," I said calmly. I turned back to the oscilloscope. The green trace of the snap was frozen on the screen. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the jagged spike. "It's a squiggly line," Mark shouted. "It means nothing." "It means everything," I said. "You see this spike at 42 Hertz? And this harmonic distortion at 800? I turned the volume knob on the Genelec speakers. "Listen." I played the isolated clip, the filtered, amplified, undeniable sound of metal failing. Grrrr! Snap. The sound filled the soundproof room. It was violent, visceral. It sounded like a bone breaking, magnified 1,000 times. Mark flinched. He stepped back. "What? What is that?" "That," I said, looking at the green line, "is the sound of an acme-threaded jackscrew stripping its threads under aerodynamic load." I turned to face my son-in-law. "It wasn't the pilot, Mark. It wasn't panic. It was the actuator bolt. I can hear the threads stripping. I can hear the lack of lubrication. The stabilizer disconnected 2 seconds before the pilot lost control." Mark stared at me. His mouth opened and closed. He looked at the vintage equipment, then at the old man he thought was deaf. How'd you know that?" Mark whispered. "Because I've heard it before," I said. "Alaska Airlines Flight 261, January 2000, off the coast of California. 88 people died because a mechanic didn't grease a bolt. It made the exact same sound. The Death Rattle." I stood up. I was taller than Mark. He often forgot that because I was always sitting. "You are trying to frame a man for manslaughter," I said. "But the audio doesn't lie, and neither do I." Mark looked at the oscilloscope. Then he looked at me. The arrogance drained out of his face, replaced by a cold, dawn-breaking terror. "But," Mark stammered, "if it's the jackscrew, if it's mechanical, then the entire fleet is grounded." I finished for him. "And Vanguard is liable for criminal negligence. And your stock goes to 0. Mark grabbed the back of the Aeron chair to steady himself. "Who are you?" Mark whispered. You're just Bill. You chew too loud. You stare at the wall." I picked up the USB drive. I closed my fist around it. "I'm the listener," I said. and we are going to need a lawyer. The drive to Washington, D.C. was a study in acoustic isolation. Mark's Audi Q8 was designed to be a sensory deprivation tank on wheels. The double-paned acoustic glass and the active noise cancellation system in the chassis scrubbed the world clean of friction. Inside, the silence was heavy, oppressive, and synthetic. It was the kind of silence that money buys to keep reality at bay. But money cannot silence a guilty conscience. I sat in the passenger seat, the Pelican case resting heavily on my lap. Inside lay my interface, my laptop, and the USB drive that contained the death of Vanguard Aviation. I stared out the window at the passing blur of the I-95 corridor, but I wasn't looking at the scenery. I was listening to Mark. He was driving with his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. His breathing was ragged, a shallow upper chest respiration rate of 24 breaths per minute. In hiss, out hiss. It was the sound of a man hyperventilating in slow motion. You realize what happens when we walk through those doors, Mark whispered, breaking the silence as we crossed the Potomac River. The water below was grey and churning, much like Mark's future. There is no going back. If you play that tape, if you are right, the stock is going to zero. The contracts are void. I lose my equity. I lose the house. Sarah loses her lifestyle. And if I don't play it? I asked, my voice vibrating low in my chest, resonating against the glass. If you don't play it, we settle, Mark pleaded, glancing at me with desperate bloodshot eyes. We pay the pilot's family a settlement. We fix the drone quietly in the next revision. We survive. Isn't that better? To survive? Survival based on a lie is just a delayed failure, I said. Like a fatigue crack in a wing spar. It doesn't heal, Mark. It propagates until the wing falls off. We pulled up to the National Transportation Safety Board headquarters. It was a brutalist structure of concrete and glass, a fortress of bureaucracy designed to withstand the storms of public outrage. A phalanx of satellite trucks and reporters swarmed the front steps, their camera flashes popping like strobe lights in a discotheque of tragedy. Park in the back, I ordered. I can't, Mark said, his voice trembling. I have to enter through the front. I'm the director of communications. If I sneak in, it looks like guilt. Park in the back, I repeated, spacing the words for maximum acoustic impact. I am not walking my equipment through a media scrum. The vibration from the crowd noise alone gives me a headache. Mark swallowed hard. The sound of his larynx clicking was audible even over the engine. He steered the car toward the service entrance. The NTSB hearing room was a cathedral of acoustic deadness. The walls were lined with fabric-wrapped fiberglass panels designed to absorb reflections. The ceiling was baffled. The carpet was thick. It was a dead room, engineered to ensure that every word spoken into the record was crisp, clear, and devoid of the chaotic reverberation of the outside world. It was packed. 300 people filled the gallery. Lawyers in three-piece suits whispered into their phones. Engineers in short-sleeved shirts clutched binders full of telemetry data. In the front row, a young woman sat alone, clutching a framed photograph of a man in a flight suit. She was weeping silently. Her shoulders shook with a frequency of about 3 hertz. The pilot's wife. I stood at the very back of the room, in the shadows near the audiovisual booth. Mark had abandoned me at the door, rushing to join his legal team at the defence table near the front. I was alone. I wore my old trench coat, fraying at the cuffs, and my grey hair was unkempt. To the casual observer, I looked like a vagrant who had wandered in from the cold to steal a cup of coffee. "Sir," a security guard stepped in front of me, his hand resting on his belt. "This is a closed hearing for credentialed personnel and family members only. You need to clear the area." I didn't move. I looked past him, toward the raised dais at the front of the room. 5 board members sat behind the long mahogany table. In the centre sat the chairman, Director Elias Vance. I knew Elias. We had spent 3 months on a barge in the Atlantic in 1996, listening to the underwater locator beacons of TWA Flight 800. We had shared headphones in a freezing hangar in Lockerbie. He was a young acoustical engineer then, bright-eyed and eager. Now he was the old guard. His hair was white, his face lined with the gravity of 1,000 autopsies of metal and bone. On the witness stand, Julian Sterling, the CEO of Vanguard Aviation, was testifying. Sterling was a masterpiece of corporate engineering. He was handsome, polished, and radiated a synthetic warmth. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone that filled the room. "Director Vance," Sterling said, "Vanguard Aviation is built on a foundation of redundancy. The XM9 logic core is the most advanced autonomous system ever deployed. It has flown 10,000 hours without a single logic fault." Sterling paused, looking directly at the crying woman in the front row. He adjusted his tie, a calculated gesture of sympathy. "The data, unfortunately, is unambiguous," Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a somber register. "The remote operator, Mr. Evans, disengaged the autopilot at 14:02:05. The telemetry shows erratic control inputs immediately following disengagement. He pulled the stick back to the stops. He induced an accelerated stall. The machine did exactly what it was commanded to do." The room murmured, a low-frequency rumble of agreement. The narrative was setting like concrete. "It is a tragedy," Sterling said, shaking his head. "But it is a human tragedy." Mr. Evans panicked. "We have the cockpit voice recorder audio. It captures his screams. It captures the sound of a man who has lost his mind." Director Vance nodded slowly, looking at the file in front of him. "We have reviewed the audio, Mr. Sterling," Vance said. "It is indeed distressing. The screaming is consistent with a loss of situational awareness." "Exactly," Sterling said. "We request that the board finds the probable cause as pilot error and closes the docket." I moved. I stepped around the security guard. "Hey," the guard shouted. "Stop! You can't go down there." He grabbed my arm. I didn't stop. I kept walking down the center aisle. My footsteps were heavy. Thud. Thud. The Pelican case banged against my leg with a hollow rhythmic sound. The murmuring in the room died instantly. Every head turned. "Security!" Sterling shouted from the stand, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Remove this man. He is disrupting a federal proceeding." 2 more guards rushed from the side doors. I stopped in the middle of the aisle, 30 feet from the dais. I looked up. I took off my sunglasses. I looked directly at Elias Vance. Vance looked down, annoyed at the interruption. He squinted against the glare of the television lights. He saw the old coat. He saw the stubble. Then he saw the eyes. Vance froze. He stopped breathing. I could hear the intake of breath from the dais through the room's PA system. Vance stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Scree." Director? Sterling asked, confused. This is clearly a mentally ill person. Let the guards handle it. Stand down, Vance barked into his microphone. The volume caused feedback to whine in the speakers. The guards froze, inches from grabbing me. Vance walked around the table. He stood at the edge of the dais, looking down at me with a mixture of disbelief and reverence. Bill? Vance whispered. I nodded once. Director Vance, I said. My voice was raspy, unused to projecting, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. I apologize for the interruption, but your audio analysis is incomplete. Incomplete? Sterling scoffed. Who is this hobo? Director, this is a farce. Vance turned his head slowly to look at Sterling. The look was withering. Mr. Sterling, Vance said coldly. This is William Halloway. He was the lead acoustics investigator for the NTSB for 30 years. He wrote the manual on spectral analysis that your engineering team failed to read. He decoded the tapes for the Challenger. He is the listener. Vance looked back at me. We thought you were gone, Bill. We heard you retired to the coast. I did, I said, but the noise followed me. I lifted the heavy Pelican case. May I approach the audio-visual console director? I have a rebuttal. Objection. Sterling's lead counsel shot up from his chair. This is highly irregular. This evidence was not submitted during discovery. We have no way to verify the source. It is an inquest, not a trial, Counselor. Vance snapped. And if Bill Halloway says he has a rebuttal, I am going to hear it. Grant him access. Connect him to the main house system. I walked to the side of the room. The AV technician, a kid barely out of college, looked at me with wide eyes. He scrambled out of his chair. Give me the XLR feed, I said. He handed me the cable. His hands were shaking. I set the case on the desk. Clack. I opened the latches. Snap. Snap. I pulled out my interface. I plugged in the USB drive. I booted up my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dim room, casting a spectral light on my face. I felt the room waiting. I felt Mark cowering in the front row, his head in his hands. I felt Sterling's glare burning into the back of my neck. But I was gone. I was in the signal chain now. Ladies and gentlemen, I said into the technician's microphone. My voice boomed through the overhead speakers. The human ear is a flawed instrument. It prioritizes volume over nuance. It hears what it expects to hear. Mr. Sterling expects you to hear a pilot screaming. He relies on the noise to hide the signal. I projected my screen onto the massive wall behind the dais. A green, jagged waveform appeared. This is the raw audio from the CVDR, I said. Let's listen to what the company provided. I hit the spacebar. Screech. The sound blasted through the courtroom. It was deafening. The wind shear. The synthetic alarms. The pilot's terrified voice. Pull up. Pull up. Why isn't she responding? Oh God. The pilot's wife covered her ears and sobbed, rocking back and forth. Sterling crossed his arms. See? Chaos. Panic. Loss of control. I hit stop. The silence rushed back in. Noise, I said. That is just noise. Now let us perform some subtraction. I opened a plug-in window on the screen, a digital parametric equalizer. I'm applying a high-pass filter at 200 Hz, I narrated, turning the virtual knob. This removes the wind buffeting and the aerodynamic rumble. I hit play. The screeching vanished. The audio was thinner, tinny, but clearer. Now, I said, I am applying a notch filter at 1.2 kHz. This is the resonant frequency of the ground proximity warning system. I dragged the frequency node down. The blaring pull-up siren disappeared from the mix. And finally, I said, I am gating the vocal track. I am removing the pilot's voice. The screaming vanished. The room was dead silent. Now, I said, what is left? I cranked the master volume fader to the maximum. Listen to the room tone, I whispered. I hit play. At first the audience heard nothing, just a low static hiss. Then they felt it. A vibration in the floorboards. A deep grinding rhythm. Do you hear that? I asked. Frequency 410 Hz. That is the AC motor of the horizontal stabilizer trim actuator. It is running. So? Sterling interrupted, standing up. The motor was running. The pilot was trying to trim the nose up. That proves he was fighting the controls. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, I said, not looking at him. I am not finished. I pointed to the spectral analyzer on the screen, a heat map of the sound. Look at the sub-harmonic, I said. Right there, at 42 Hz. A faint, rhythmic clicking sound emerged from the speakers. Clack, clack, clack. That, I said, is the sound of the threads on the jackscrew skipping. The nut is stripping. The motor is turning, but it isn't moving the tail. It is grinding the bolt into iron filings. I turned to look at the CEO. And then, I said, the moment of failure. I let the audio run. The clacking got faster, louder, desperate. Clack, 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 grrr. And then, the sound that would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. Snap. It wasn't a soft sound. Even through the filters, it was a violent, metallic gunshot. It was the sound of high tensile steel shearing under 10 tons of aerodynamic load. Wah! The motor sound changed instantly. It went up in pitch, a high-pitched whine. Did you hear the pitch change? I asked the room. The motor sped up. Why? Because the resistance was gone. The stabilizer had disconnected. The tail was flapping in the wind like a broken shutter. I checked the timestamp on the screen. The snap occurred at 14:02:03, I said. The pilot did not scream until 14:02:05. The aircraft was mechanically dead 2 seconds before the pilot realized he was in trouble. I turned to the dais. The stabilizer failed, Director. The bolt sheared. The pilot was flying a paperweight. Director Vance looked pale. He took off his glasses and wiped them with a shaking hand. He looked at the spectral graph on the screen. Mr. Sterling, Vance said, his voice ice cold. Do you have an explanation for this acoustic signature? Sterling stood up. He was sweating now. The polish was cracking. The synthetic warmth was gone, replaced by the cornered look of a man watching his net worth evaporate. This is voodoo science, Sterling stammered, pointing at me. He is manipulating the audio. He is adding sounds that aren't there. That click could be anything. It could be a loose pen in the cockpit. It could be interference from the satellite link. It is not interference, I said. I reached into my bag. I pulled out a large, rolled-up sheet of paper. I walked to the dais. The security guard stepped aside this time. I laid the paper out in front of Vance. This, I said, pointing to the top graph, is the spectral analysis of Alaska Airlines Flight 261. The NTSB database, file number DCA00MA023. I pointed to the screen. And this is the spectral graph of your drone. I overlaid them. The fingerprints were identical. The 42 Hz click. The 400 Hz hum. The specific decay rate of the snap. It was a perfect match. It is a match, I said. A perfect mechanical match. The same failure mode, the same geometry, the same physics. I turned to Sterling. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Jack screw assemblies require lubrication every 600 flight hours, I said. If you skip the lubrication, the friction increases, the metal heats up, the threads strip. It sings a song before it dies, Mr. Sterling. The Death Rattle. We just heard it. I looked at Mark, who was sitting in the front row, his head buried in his hands. My son-in-law told me the Logic Core had 10,000 hours, I said. Did the airframe have 10,000 hours? Or did you just swap the brain into an old body to save money? Sterling looked around the room. He saw the reporters typing furiously on their phones. He saw the pilot's wife looking at him with a mixture of hatred and relief. He saw his legal team closing their laptops, physically distancing themselves from him. Sterling choked. We have a predictive maintenance schedule. The AI monitors the vibration levels. It would have flagged an anomaly. The AI listens for digital errors, I said. It doesn't listen to the metal. It filters out the noise, just like you did. I unplugged my laptop. The screen on the wall went black. You killed those people to save 4 hours of grease time, I said quietly. Director, Sterling pleaded. I object. This is speculation. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, Vance barked. The gavel came down. Bang. It sounded just like the snap on the tape. This hearing is suspended, Vance announced. I'm ordering an immediate forensic metallurgical analysis of the wreckage, specifically the jack screw assembly. And I'm ordering the grounding of the entire Vanguard XM9 fleet, effective immediately. Pandemonium. Reporters rushed the aisle. Lawyers shouted instructions. The pilot's wife burst into tears, hugging her lawyer. I didn't stay. I didn't want the interviews. I didn't want the spotlights. I packed my interface. I wound my cables. I closed the Pelican case. Click, click. I walked back up the aisle. As I passed the front row, the pilot's wife looked up. Her eyes were red, but the desperation was gone. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for listening to him. I nodded. He was a good pilot, Mum. He fought it all the way down. I walked out the back door. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of a vacuum after an explosion. The blast had happened. The dust was settling. Mark drove. He was shaking. His hands gripped the wheel so hard I thought the leather would tear. It's over, Mark whispered, staring blankly at the road. Vanguard, the stock, my options. It's all going to zero. They'll indict Sterling. They might indict me for the press release. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of horror and awe. You destroyed it all, Bill. In 10 minutes. You took apart a billion-dollar company with a laptop and a pair of headphones. I didn't destroy anything, I said, looking out the window at the passing streetlights. The bolt was already broken, Mark. I just turned on the lights. But why? Mark asked. Why did you care? You sit in that basement. You ignore the world. You let us think you were deaf. Why did you come out for this? Because of the frequency, I said. I tapped my ear. The truth has a frequency, Mark. It vibrates. It resonates. You can try to bury it under noise. You can try to talk over it with PR spin and stock prices. You can try to hide it in the cloud. But the signal is always there. And eventually, someone is going to tune in. Mark looked back at the road. He began to cry. Soft, pathetic sobs. He was mourning his ambition. He was realizing that he had spent his life building a castle on a foundation of lies, and a silent old man had just pulled the keystone. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "I'm sorry I called you deaf." "I'm not deaf," I said. "I just don't like what I hear most of the time." We pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as we left it, but everything had changed. I got out of the car. I didn't wait for him. I walked into the house. Sarah was in the kitchen, watching the news. Her mouth was open. The TV showed the headline, "Whistleblower exposes Vanguard crash." "The Death Rattle." She looked at me. She looked at the Pelican case in my hand. "Dad?" she asked. Was that you?" I didn't answer. I just walked past her. I opened the basement door. The smell of dust and ozone welcomed me. It was the smell of home. I walked down the stairs. I closed the heavy oak door behind me. The seal engaged. Thump! The noise of the world was gone. The noise of the crying CEO. The noise of the reporters. The noise of my son-in-law's crumbling ego. It was just the room tone, the sound of silence. I walked to my rack. I put the Pelican case on the floor. I sat in my Aeron chair. I picked up my Sony MDR 7506S. I put them on. I didn't play any music. I didn't play any tapes. I just sat there, encased in the acoustic foam, protected from the signal. I closed my eyes. I took a deep breath. "Finally," I whispered. Quiet.